Okay, welcome everyone to this webinar in which we'll be discussing the recently released Evaluation and Learning Report for the Yuwaya Ngarra-li partnership between UNSW and the Dharriwaa Elders Group in Walgett. I'm Ruth McCausland, for those of you I don't know. I'm the UNSW Director of Yuwaya Ngarra-li. I'm joining from Gadigal country this afternoon, and I pay my deep respects to elders past and present here and on all the unceded country that you're joining us from today. I particularly like to acknowledge the elders and custodians of Miller-Dawkins country, including our colleagues at the Dharriwaa Elders Group. Now, we've been running these webinars for the past couple of years as a way to share what we've been working on. And the topics have ranged from food and water security, ethical research with Aboriginal community controlled organisations. We've discussed housing, community-led use diversion and data linkage, and also dealing with fine debt. In those webinars, we've always sought to prioritise the voices and the priorities of colleagues at the Dharriwaa Elders Group. So this webinar, like this report, is a little different from a lot of past webinars and publications in that you'll just be hearing from those of us on the UNSW side of the partnership with colleagues Peta MacGillivray, who's here, Rebecca Reeve, along with our long-term advisor and adjunct senior lecturer here at UNSW, Miller-Dawkins. So today we're aiming to discuss the methodology and the findings of our recently published Evaluation and Learning Report. It covers work resourced over the past 4 years by the Paul Ramsay Foundation. Now, our plan with today's webinar isn't to present all of the content of the report. You can read that for yourselves. We've kept it uncharacteristically short and not too wordy. We thought what might be of value as a complementary piece that this webinar could bring is to talk you through our methodology that we've developed in terms of our work on evaluation, and also present some of the findings, but have a particular focus on the outcomes that we've tracked over the past 4 years, and also work focused particularly on children and young people as part of Yuwaya Ngarra-li. We're also planning to leave a good chunk of time at the end for questions and discussion after we each present on various elements of the report. So please do add any questions that you might have to the chat, and I'll keep an eye on them, and we'll endeavour to get them covered and answered later in the webinar by all the panellists. So we thought it might be useful, just because we've had some RSVPs from people who haven't necessarily been to past webinars, we thought it would be useful to start with some of the context about the Yuwaya Ngarra-li partnership with the Elders Group, for those of you who might be interested in that, as a kind of grounding to our discussion about the work on evaluation and learning. For that, I will hand to my colleague, Peta.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. What I would like to talk to you about, I'm Peta MacGillivray, by the way. What I would like to talk to you about is our Yuwaya Ngarra-li partnership, illustrated in this diagram, which really nicely sets out some of the core components of how the partnership works, its governance and its focus. So in the middle of the diagram, you can see there the Yuwaya Ngarra-li team. The team sits both within the Dharriwaa Elders Group, with the Dharriwaa Elders Group employing core staff to the work of the partnership on the ground in Walgett. And then we have UNSW team members based at UNSW and around New South Wales, all working for the partnership as well, focusing on the research, evaluation and learning of our partnership's effort. And you can see there the ring that surrounds that team being the Dharriwaa Elders Group Elders Council, who sets the vision for the partnership and is also core to the governance, both at the DEG, the Dharriwaa Elders Group end, and to the partnership entity Yuwaya Ngarra-li. So the pieces of the pie that you can see in those various shades are circulating. We have youth justice and wellbeing as one example, dealing with fines, housing. They're the focus areas of our partnership's work, the priorities that have been set by the Dharriwaa Elders Group. And over the years of our partnership's work have shifted and have changed slightly depending upon things that are happening in Walgett, but also things that are happening at a structural level, which are having an impact on the ground in Walgett. On the outside ring, you can see there our core principles of our Yuwaya Ngarra-li partnership. So that we are rights-based, holistic, community-led, culturally connected, and strengths-focused. And those principles have been developed by the Dharriwaa Elders Group and UNSW working in partnership through Yuwaya Ngarra-li. The final ring on the outside is the data research and evaluation, which is also core to our way of working. And that's this evaluation work that we've been doing is that in action applied, and what we'll be talking about today. I'll pass back on.
Thanks to Pete. Can we then turn to the evaluation question. So I guess very early on in the partnership, we worked with the Elders Group on honing some key questions that we wanted to measure and track over time. And I guess from the outset, it's good to mention, you know, my background is, my PhD was in criminology and evaluation, and it was an area that I'd worked in for quite some time, and Beck and Peter and May have as well outside of our work on the partnership. But this didn't necessarily come from our expertise. This focus on evaluation and learning very much came from the Elders Group themselves. So from the kind of founding elders, more than a couple of decades ago, of the Elders Group, there was this real interest in building the evidence base for what the Elders Group felt was the change that was needed in their community. They really saw the value of that. They had long-term engagement in research and advocacy with that in mind, but definitely were keen that we have a formal element of evaluation and evidence building to our work. So early on, I guess, the evaluation questions we identified were about the contributions of the partnership to improving the wellbeing, social, built and physical environment and life pathways of Aboriginal people in Walgett. So this was our primary focus, was on outcomes at a community level. However, as I mentioned from the outset, there was real interest in thinking about what we're learning through the partnership as a model of community uni partnership in setting up, in managing and maintaining the conditions for change happening at individual, community, place-based and systems levels. So our methodology was very much informed by the context and purpose of our work. So that was around working deeply in one place, led by a local Aboriginal community controlled organisation in their vision for change, to build and influence broader systems change. So in order to do that, the kind of methodology that we refined was about an embedded approach, so an embedded team at the UNSW end, which made sense based on the nature of the partnership, working deeply together, bringing expertise that we had to the Elders' vision for change as a basis for integrated and ongoing learning and evaluation, and also research, our broader research work. Also, I suppose it made sense to have a developmental approach. So we had some expertise in different projects using developmental methodology, I guess particularly influenced by work by Michael Quinn Patton and others around the kind of aim of the work to develop and test this as a new way of working, a new model for supporting the vision of community controlled initiatives through the partnership. But it was a focus very much on actionable learning for the benefit of the Elders Group and the broader community. And we were really interested in the kind of elements and methods brought with developmental evaluation to be learning as we were doing and refining. And I guess to do that, we really drew on a range of methods and data sources. Now, there's an infographic which is also included in the report, which is incredibly detailed. Depending on how big your screen is, you might not be able to read that. But I guess this is something that we've developed more recently, but as a way of, it obviously connects to our overall kind of wheel diagram that we have that Peter talked through earlier. So this is still underpinned by the core principles of our work together. But this is kind of squarely, I suppose, anchoring the work that we do, or the purpose, including of the work around evaluation, in improving lives. You know, that the kind of outer tabs there, the kind of why of this work, community control, on evidence-based solutions, and on systems change. And I guess the rings inside that, as you can kind of see, is that who we work with, and again, the kind of principles, the how we work. But the inner wedges, I suppose, is what we are going to be covering some of today, which are the different methods at different times that we have used and drawn upon. And we found that it's really only through a combination of methods that it's possible to understand how change is happening and for whom. And the combination of methods include quantitative methods, so surveys and government data analysis. And our colleague Rebecca Reeve will talk more about the kind of administrative data piece later on today. Qualitative methods, so the yarning and qualitative interviews that we've employed at different times, and also learning with and from practitioners. That really embedded approach with our colleagues running programs at the Elders Group has been really important, as well as other practitioners that we've worked with over the years. And also kind of more mixed methods like applied and collaborative research that have been a core part of our work, and also outcomes harvesting. And our colleague May will talk that through a little bit more. We know a lot of you are really interested in that method. So we've used the different methods, so that wedge of what we do, the wedges on that inner part of the infographic, for particular purposes at particular times. And we've brought them together at different times, like such as this evaluation report, for more comprehensive analysis. So I'll now hand over to May to talk you through some of the work around outcomes harvesting.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Ruth. So outcomes harvesting has been a kind of major part, and you would have seen that highlighted in the report of this evaluation. And Yuwaya Ngarra-li really adopted this as a method in 2021. And so we both applied it kind of a bit retrospectively, and then also started doing it in an ongoing way from 2021. And we really adopted it to help understand emergent outcomes that the initiative credibly influenced, that we thought contributed to the long-term goals that the elders had set. So the reason why we felt outcomes harvesting was important was because of the kind of fact that the initiative is built on long-term goals. So things like improving the social determinants of health of the community, reducing contact with the criminal justice system. And the work to influence that is long-term and holistic and uses a whole range of different methods. And so as such, it's both operating in a very complex environment, but also operating often in very complex and nuanced ways. And what outcomes harvesting allowed us to do was to really understand where that was having some influence and something was happening in that very emergent way. So we weren't saying, this is what we plan to do and did we do it? And we weren't really just keeping to tracking a set of static KPIs. We were actually trying to understand what is the influence and the impact that this initiative is having on people in Walgett, but also more broadly. So to talk a bit about how we've used it, this is one of my favourite little cartoons about the differences between outcomes and outputs. So not the number of times you say boo, but the amount that you strike fear into the hearts of the living. But one of the things that's very important is that when we collect an outcome, we really define that as something that another actor has either done. So say there's an organisation that, due to the collaboration they're having with the Dharriwaa Elders Group, actually creates a new program or changes their practice in some way, that would be an outcome that we would capture. Or an outcome could also be something that changes in the lives of the people, particularly that the Elders Group is working directly with. So, for example, a young person that successfully completes youth justice conferencing because of a kind of holistic support that they're given by the Elders Group to do that, could also be a kind of an outcome. I've done this in the past, outcomes harvesting, in a way that's kind of classic, more classic to the methodology. You're a more external evaluator. You collect a set of outcomes. You kind of write up these quite elaborate outcome statements and you verify them with third parties. We've done this in a more embedded way, in that we're kind of collecting the outcomes as we go, and we're often kind of verifying them at the time, because frequently what will happen is that there'll actually be even direct acknowledgement, say by a government agency, saying this has happened and it was due to your input or influence. And so we kind of use that correspondence often as a way of verifying both that the thing has happened, but also that Yuwaya Ngarra-li has made a contribution to it happening. As we collect these outcomes, we code them across different categories. And then we also have discussions around them to make sure we're getting them right, and have a lot of discussion often on the contribution side. Do we think that we did influence that, and what evidence do we have for that? And then we periodically analyse the kind of data set that we've collected. So at least annually, we'll do some data to understand. And so I wanted to share a couple of highlights of what this method has enabled us to see, to understand, and to do differently. So one of the great powers of it is the ability to see and understand progress. So especially for our colleagues in Walgett, in the community-based team, who are often working, you know, on such difficult issues, long-term issues, it's actually been very significant to them to be able to see the progress over time. It often provides a real kind of boost. But another dimension of this, more on the right-hand side, is to understand the balance of impact. So where is the initiative finding traction and having an influence? And you can kind of see the colours of years in this level of outcome chart, and kind of, so it kind of shifts, the balance shifts over time a bit. But one of the important things that this analysis has shown us, which aligns with a lot of existing evidence more broadly, is that focusing on benefits for the Aboriginal community has generated, you know, almost as many outcomes for the whole community, what we call place-based outcomes. So, and then over time, we've had an increasing ability to have that experience, insight, research, advocacy influence more broadly. So either by other communities taking up practice, or by the elders group, you know, having a real influence on state-based and national policy discussions. So just to make these concrete, some examples from youth wellbeing and dealing with fines areas of work. So in the Aboriginal community level, that example I used before of people successfully completing youth justice conferencing processes and improving that diversion process. But a place-based example of that is actually when police were increasingly using diversionary options under the Young Offenders Act in Walgett, and obviously that's relevant for the whole community. Whereas at a more kind of systemic level, the New South Wales Law Enforcement Conduct Commission, their report on the New South Wales Police Force Aboriginal Strategic Direction 2018 to 2023 highlights Walgett's fines, the use of fines in the Walgett community, and the work of the elders group as evidence of the need for systemic reform in police practice. Pete, if we could go back one slide. Yeah, so another element around outcomes is the ability to understand kind of how we're contributing to these outcomes. So the chart on the left around planned versus responsive action has been really critical for the team in recognising that the nature of the work is that a significant proportion of outcomes, all of which are contributing to long-term goals, are emerging from work that is responsive and not planned. So this is responsive to community needs and to crises such as flooding. So some examples of this is that work on dealing with fines, which has actually, you know, helped write off, you know, over $250,000 of fines now. That actually did emerge from the overuse of COVID fines, and there was an ability to kind of be responsive to that and then to build out an area of work. And that's been very significant for the team in how we plan. So it's enabled everybody to kind of allow for more space in their planning to enable response, has strengthened strategies and teams focused on community response, and has also provided this kind of common language and understanding in how to better, in a way, adapt everybody's expectations and shift focus and resources when needed without people feeling like they're failing because they're not sticking to the plan. The mix of outcomes has also helped us understand the mix of roles, the contributions Yuwaya Ngarra-li is making. So this chart on the right-hand side, so this mix of leading and direct programming in community, collaborating with agencies locally and across the state and nation and even internationally, and then strong role in research, advocacy and communications. And then Pete, we'll go to the next one. And then just to tell a story, which will feed into what Pete's talking about what we can see in changes in our programs over time. So these charts, one is about the youth justice and wellbeing outcomes from 2020 through to the end of 2023, and the other is the dealing with fines, which was really set up in 2022 and ran through 2023 and is ongoing. And so kind of taken together and with the other methods we've used, we can see and understand that spike of outcomes in 2021 and the part of 2022 represents when we tested the Two River pathway to change in our youth wellbeing and justice work, which Pete will talk more about, with a youth team that was working closely one-on-one with young people. And through that work, we realised that we needed to be doing that in a more collaborative way with other agencies, which is something the team has now been working on, designing and developing with other Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, such as the ALS. I know some of them are here today, and the Walgett Aboriginal Medical Service. But coming out of that work was this focus on the fine burden in the community and dealing with fines. And that generated significant outcomes by helping to address that large amount of fines that were sitting in the community at the time, again, working with colleagues at the ALS. And so you can kind of see from these charts how the kind of community-facing effort shifted for a time while actually focused on the same long-term goals about reducing contact with the criminal justice system and increasing wellbeing. So I'll pass back to Pete to talk more about this area of work.
Thank you, May. So I want to talk about the use of some of the methodologies from the wedges that you can see in our research learning and evaluation wheel in the children and young people and wellbeing work, and in particular, improving justice outcomes for young people understood holistically as set in the vision of the elders group. So some of the methods that we used, and reminding you of our mixed method approach, we were able to use the methodology of community surveys early in the partnership through pool days that were hosted by the Dharriwaa Elders Group in partnership with Walgett Aboriginal Medical Service. So Yuwaya Ngarra-li, myself, as the lead on the ground in Walgett, with Dharriwaa Elders Group staff, and bringing on Aboriginal social work students with us in the team to conduct surveys with young people. We did that multiple years. We also conducted yarns and qualitative interviews with young people with Dharriwaa Elders Group staff as part of the qualitative information that we've used both in the partnership and in evaluation. We've also practiced the learning with and from practitioners through having the evaluation embedded, because working closely with the youth team, with the two youth coordinators, we were able to look at the program logs and the detail of what those youth workers were gathering in working closely with young people, including workshops that we've run with staff. They also were a way that we were able to learn directly from the practice of the Dharriwaa Elders Group staff on the ground and how they were working with young people. And also our reflection and planning session notes also formed the data of what we looked at as part of that learning with and from practitioners. I should also mention, and our colleague Beck will speak next on some of the quantitative methods, but Boxar data that Beck was analysing and that we used together in working closely with Dharriwaa Elders Group staff became really important in the evaluation through the work that we were doing with the Walgett Wellbeing working group. So a holistic working group, sorry. So that also was really important in the data that we're using and how it was practiced in this embedded way of working. Yes, okay, I think that's it from me. So we'll pass on to Beck.
Thanks, Pete. I'm just going to talk to you in a little bit more detail about some of the government administrative data that we've used, which Pete touched on in talking about Boxar data. So this is just one of, as you've heard, the many different research and evaluation tools that we use. where it can be useful to help to answer some of the questions and measure some of the outcomes of interest to the community. And this is all analysed in collaboration, very iterative process with the DEG. But when we first started using government administrative data, we focused particularly on what was publicly available, and our use of those data have become more sophisticated and detailed over time. The reason for doing it that way was because we were all building our understanding of the data and how we analyse data together, and wanting to make sure that the data that we access and use is relevant and meaningful to the community. However, having looked initially at publicly available data such as education data, police data, data from the Boxar website and so on, it became really clear that we needed more disaggregated data and data at different geographic levels than is usually available in what's publicly available data. So I've just put a few examples on the slide there to talk to you about some of the ways that we use government administrative data that helps to inform the work with children and young people and measure those outcomes. On the left there, you can see a chart where using unit record data that was de-identified and provided by the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, Boxar. Sorry, can you go back a slide, Pete? Thanks. This helped us to look at the increased use of police diversions over time and the reduced numbers of Aboriginal young people from Walgett who are appearing in the children's court. And I've just taken a snapshot there of one of the outcomes we looked at, which was the number of young people who had finalised court cases every year from 2016 through to 2021. Bearing in mind that the work with children and young people really commenced in 2018. And we can see quite clearly there that reducing over time. However, we also realised, and I'll talk about this a bit more in a minute, that through talking with the elders group and the way we analyse the data together, that looking solely at what's happening in the criminal justice system is really not sufficient. So I'll tell you a bit more about how we're trying to do this work more holistically. Before I get onto that though, if you move to the middle slide, the middle chart in the slide, this is data that we obtained from Revenue New South Wales dashboards, which are available online and can be searched by postcode. And that particular shot there shows us overdue fines in the Walgett postcode. And I've split that up by age based on data that I obtained from the dashboard. You can see the community as a whole has over $1 million worth of fines. So this is, and for young people, we've got young people aged 18 to 24, they have $116,000 worth of overdue fines at the moment. Most overdue fines in Walgett are over 2 years old, and the fine burden contributes to the overall economic burden on households living in Walgett with energy poverty, high prices of food, high price of water that often needs to be purchased because of sodium contamination in the water source. So this is just part of a much bigger picture, but it helps to inform the work of the Dealing with Fines team. We also drill down into that data to look at things like what are the different categories of fines. So young people, for example, it's often for not displaying P plates and things like that. So that helps to work then for the DEG and the Dealing with Fines team to work with those young people to help address some of the underlying issues. And the DEG's Working Development Order program is helping people to pay off some of that fine debt. So the last slide there shows you in the last financial year what the value of fine debt cleared through participation in the WDO program was, and that together with data that the Aboriginal Legal Service collect on fines that the DEG, working together with the Aboriginal Legal Service, are helping young people to write off and other people in the community to write off. that all contributes to measuring those outcomes of the value of fine debt cleared and fines written off. So this work really contributes to both what's happening for children and young people, but also generally. But as I said, all of these things need to be looked at more holistically. We've realised through the communication and consultation and analysis that we've been conducting with the Dharriwaa Elders Group that things like addressing housing needs, education and so on are all part of finding the solutions basically to these issues lie not only in the criminal justice system. So young people's overrepresentation in the criminal justice system needs to also consider, the quality of housing, exclusion from education, the burden of fine debt combined with everything else and all of those things together. So we're developing a linked data set that will draw on data from a range of different areas so that we can look at this together more holistically. That will inform the work that's happening with children and young people, and also help to measure outcomes, not just in terms of criminal justice outcomes, but the impact of that work on other spheres of life as well. So I'll hand back now. Thank you. Thanks,
Beck. Interestingly, in the time that Beck's been working as part of the UNSW side of the partnership, the Elders Group were always really interested in government administrative data and in saying this is data that is about us. We should have access to it. We should be able to use it for our purposes. And I guess in this time, there's also been the priority reform for under closing the gap commitments by governments around greater sharing of data with Aboriginal communities. And what's been really interesting in Beck's and Peta's work too, involved in questions of Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance, is we've seen those kind of commitments from government. And a colleague who's joined us more recently, Ashley Shepherd, was really involved with this in her time within the New South Wales government. Lots of people grappling with actually how you enable access, meaningful access by communities to data in a way that is meaningful when you need the kind of expertise of someone like Beck to translate and interpret and be involved in that process. And so I guess increasingly Beck and Peta's engagement with different data custodians and New South Wales government agencies around how to do this work in a meaningfully community-led way has been really helpful for us, but also has had some influence around some of the kind of practice of different agencies. So, it's been a really interesting process to be part of and a kind of example of how you can do this meaningfully. But for us, it's always about not the expertise at the UNSW end being the end in itself, or the analysis or the kind of publications from this, but actually about meaningfully having the data in community hands to analyse and use in the way that they see fit and to make sense of, as Beck mentioned. So much of that information about court data or police data, you actually need the community knowledge and grounding to make sense of. So we thought before we go to questions, we would also reflect on what we have in the report in a kind of higher level summary detail around work that we've done and kind of grouped thematically over the years about what we've learnt around what it takes to see these outcomes and work in this way. And this is, I guess, that second evaluation around what we've learnt about this as a model of collaboration for change. And so I guess since that invitation, which now is 2016, we've learnt a lot around, kind of change at an individual level for community members at a place-based level. And I know there are colleagues on this call and elsewhere who work on other place-based initiatives who have particular interest in methods and questions of grappling with this, and government increasingly is seeing the value of place-based approaches. I guess our work has also always been focused on changes at institutional and systems level too. So I guess one of the things we've learnt has been really valuable is being led by the Elders Group's vision for change and underpinned by shared values that we really worked deeply on early on in the partnership, but regularly return to in terms of what that means in practice. And we've used a term which I think May introduced us to, but which has just resonated so deeply around working at the speed of trust, which is not something that academics usually do when you've really required in terms of publication and grant timelines to work in a particular kind of timeline. It's something that we've all practiced a lot and got much better at and continue to learn about. in terms of how to adapt and respond to changing conditions and community priorities as needed. So if it's a genuinely community-led partnership, then the kind of timelines at the university end always come second to that. So what we found is those core principles that Peta talked through earlier on, as articulated by the DEG, and there's a briefing paper on our the Elders Group website and the UNSW Yuwaya Ngarra-li website, written by Virginia Robinson, Secretary of the Dharriwaa Elders Group, were articulated from the Elders Group perspective what those principles mean and what they look like in practice. So they've been able to ground decision-making, including that sort of responsive decision-making that May talked through that was so characteristic, particularly during COVID, but is actually something that is now embedded and understood as a very common and important element of our work together. So grounded decision-making, it's also informed research protocols for this. There's also a linked data protocol. All of this is on our website if you're interested, which has really guided that work, including with data custodians on behalf of the DG, but also daily practice and our regular reflection and planning sessions, which May will talk through in a little bit more detail, have been incredibly valuable in that way. So I guess, early on we identified, capacity building as a focus of our work. People often assumed that that was at a community level, but actually certainly the capacity building at the university end has been massive too. And a lot of that learning, we've also written the recent article, which is less pithy than this report, 11,000 words, which is coming out in an upcoming edition of the Transform journal around community engaged scholarship, where we write a lot more about what we've learned about what this looks like in practice. So that's a bit more detail around that. But really the commitment of many people at the university end to learn, to be vulnerable and humble and learn to work differently in a community-led partnership has been really key to a lot of the outcomes that we've seen. And particular shout out to colleagues working on food and water security in the Global Water Institute, in engineering, and at the George Institute, who have been fantastic collaborators on that work. So, that long-term commitment at the university end, rather than just a short-term research project, was definitely critically important from the outset, and very different, as I mentioned, from the usual metrics of academic success. And we've seen really significant increase at the university end in the capability to work in a genuinely community-led way, and the kind of knowledge about working as an effective intermediary. That language of intermediary has been an important one for us to think about the contribution and the role of the university. And of course, not just UNSW, but many universities are thinking about their contribution to social impact and community partnership. And certainly UNSW was, and our alignment with strategy that prioritised partnership and community impact and collaboration has been incredibly helpful to making our work valued and visible at the UNSW end. So that incredibly strong leadership support from Professor Eileen Baldry, who was involved in early research collaboration with the Elders Group and trusted in that role, as she then moved into more of a leadership role at the university, took up that principle and that invitation of working in a community-led way in a very meaningful sense, and embedded that with the former Vice-Chancellor in university strategy and planning. And that's been continued on with the current Vice-Chancellor, Attila Brungs, and the division that we now sit in with Verity Firth and Bruce Watson as fantastic leaders of this work around societal impact, equity and engagement. So this has been really important, I guess, in supporting the UNSW team to be able to take on the role of being responsive around whatever has been needed. So this kind of formal research and evaluation and learning role, but also multiple other roles depending on what's useful at a community level. Data analysis, of course, but then also specialist advice and coaching. Peta has played particularly important roles and continue to with Aboriginal staff at the Elders Group end in work around youth justice and community troubleshooting and other issues in that area, but also resourcing and connecting with broader networks where that's been useful and important. So what we've seen is that this has obviously been a different way of working, but one of the interesting things that we've learned along the way is that it's also led to ticking many of the more conventional academic boxes. So, research grants, although more multidisciplinary ones, which has been really valuable and interesting to have collaborators from different faculties across the university. Publications in international journals, national awards for student projects, so honours and master's student projects, and also being used increasingly, in kind of university impact evidence and case studies at a global level too. So the value of the work, I guess, has become increasingly visible at the university end. I'll hand over to May to talk more about what we've learned.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the next two areas. So certainly the Paul Ramsay Foundation funding since 2018 and support to take that community-led approach has been critical to the partnership. And there's, I guess, two things that have been really important about that. One is that it has, as it's become increasingly unrestricted funding over time, and it has been multi-year funding on over a couple of cycles, it has enabled that flexible and responsive approach that's reflected in the outcomes. And so that's been really critically important to get away from project funding, which keeps, especially smaller community organisations just tied in that kind of starvation cycle of not having enough resources for their own development and being tied to plans that may become irrelevant very fast as circumstances change. But the other thing that's been really important around that is that it's provided some solid independence for the elders group, where they have felt able to speak out very strongly on different issues that at times maybe other organisations have felt more worried about speaking out on because of their predominantly government funding. The other area that we've talked about already but has been important is the ongoing reflective practice within the initiative. So in very practical terms, we have regular sessions in which the team in Walgett and at UNSW steps back and is able to reflect on what they're hearing from community, what they're noticing change in the broader context, where things are going well and not. In the past, we've done regular kind of stakeholder and power mapping that we've come back to again and again. But those processes of kind of talking through, making sense of what everybody's seeing, testing everybody's assumptions, working through what the best contribution of the initiative could be, have been, really important moments to kind of often change direction, identify something to respond to, and to create kind of understanding across the work. So those have been really critical to the kind of engine, in a way, of the partnership and the initiative, as well as feeding into this evaluative work as well.
So I'm just going to talk a bit about working holistically and what that means for us. So working holistically is one of the underlying principles of the Yuwaya Ngarra-li partnership, and that means not working in a siloed way, but really recognising and working in a way that recognises that everything is connected. So in the partnership, as you've seen, we work at multiple levels, with looking at outcomes at the community level, the individual level, environmental level, the systems level. So holistic in that way, but also holistic by spanning across multiple different areas. So we've got the caring for country, for example, and Aboriginal community control, housing, what's happening with young people in the criminal justice system and everything related to that. So it's very much taking a broad perspective across all domains, which is really necessary if we want to make a difference to people in the community. And it also requires having a multidisciplinary team. So not only do we have people at the community end and at the UNSW end, but within those teams, people with different skills and backgrounds who all contribute to the work. So I think holistic applies at all sorts of levels. In terms of how we measure outcomes and use data, as I was talking about briefly before, in the context of young people's contact with the criminal justice system, it's very clear that addressing that is not just about addressing the use of diversionary options and reducing young people's appearance in court through the criminal justice system itself, but it also requires addressing all those other underlying issues, reducing the fine debt, which can be criminalising, addressing housing needs, addressing education needs, health and wellbeing needs, and so on. So all of those things are interconnected in the way we conduct our research and evaluation. I'll hand over to Peta.
Thanks, Beck. Two of the key learnings from our work, and it's documented in this evaluation and learnings report, is the significance and the criticalness of building local Aboriginal staff on the ground in Walgett from the community. The success and the progress of the community-led initiatives is only achieved through the commitment and the deep relationships and links to community from staff at the Elders Group. The community troubleshooters, the advocates, the elder support staff, the team working in the Food and Water for Life work, the youth team. It's not just a 9-to-5 job, and what the staff are doing every day and enabling the work to both respond to needs in moments of crisis or disaster, but also just in community life every day. That's the work that they're doing. We now have recruited 13 staff on the ground in the Dharriwaa Elders Group through the work of the partnership. But that also requires the infrastructure and the practice of supporting staff to be able to do what they do. And we've learned a lot about what that takes. One of the things that Yuwaya Ngarra-li is doing is working on designing a model of ACCHO capability that responds to the reality and the context of community life similar to Walgett, because a lot of the needs are systemic. So there are communities all around the country, due to remoteness or due to the disproportionate impact or experience for Aboriginal people related to health and the like, that these types of learnings are relevant to. And with that, I'll just quickly mention another important learning from the evaluation report and from our work in Yuwaya Ngarra-li is addressing ongoing racism and the relevance of remoteness in being able to give an adequate picture of what we are identifying despite all the progress, because we know that without identifying the ongoing impacts of institutional racism and remoteness in Walgett, it's difficult to be able to explain the things that we're not seeing the progress that we want. And for example, the water situation. So Beck mentioned the sodium contamination, but that's an example where the water in Walgett is high in sodium. It disproportionately impacts upon Aboriginal people in the community because of the high, more likeliness to experience chronic disease and to be able to afford bottled water as an alternative. There's been significant effort that's gone into documenting and providing the evidence to advocate for systemic change, including the surveying of community members to demonstrate just the water insecurity issues, the food insecurity issues, the water testing that goes on. All of that work undertaken by the Dharriwaa Elders Group and collaborators from UNSW has identified the solutions, and we've engaged politicians and government and the media in covering what is required, and yet there are still these barriers of institutional racism and remoteness that get in the way of the real change that is needed. Now, some of those, technical solutions can be put down to, the remoteness, but we know that these are systemic failures, and even government are starting to document what those are. But now we know that that we need to keep talking about the impact of racism in trying to get the change that we need. And so with that,
thanks so much, Paige.
Yep.
Can we stay with you as we move to questions?
Sure.
Because there's a couple of corkers in the chat that I think you're beautifully placed to answer. The first one comes from an anonymous participant, which makes it sound intriguing, but it's actually an excellent question that is very direct. You mentioned priority reform 4 earlier. What do you believe would need to come out of this to better enable the kind of work that Yuwaya Ngarra-li is doing and to support Indigenous data sovereignty and governance in general?
That's a great question. What would need to enable more of what Yuwaya Ngarra-li is doing?
Yeah, what would come out of the work, I guess, within government?
I think you would see the investment of resources on the ground into community organisations, Aboriginal community controlled organisations, to help prepare the readiness for doing the work, and also for those institutions or organisations that can collaborate and partner with Aboriginal community controlled organisations to work together for the ACOs to decide what they want. So it can't just be about, and I think that's the best thing about the Yuwaya Ngarra-li model of working and what we've learned about partnership, to ensure that the community controlled organisations are the ones in the driving seat about what the data can do and how it's needed, as opposed to a lot of people and entities who are interested in data kind of controlling the process. There's a great deal of work that needs to go into achieving genuinely community-led work around data, and that starts with genuine engagement with the Indigenous data sovereignty principles. There's still a lot of work. There's lots of people who use the language, but I don't think have properly familiarized themselves or engaged with what Indigenous data sovereignty and governance actually is. And that's the starting point.
Thanks, Pete. Beck, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think we've been on quite a journey when it comes to helping the government to live up to their Priority Reform 4 commitments for data sharing with Aboriginal communities. And that's been a really exciting journey, because I think we've all come a long way and working together on that, and the recognition of some of what Pete's saying, that this is it's a step towards Indigenous data sovereignty and data governance, but whilst the control and the power stay with the data custodians, there's still some limits to that. But it's been a really nice, especially over the last year or so, as we've been working with data custodians to get access to data for this linkage project that we're developing. The role of the data connectors in government and champions in various departments who really see the value of this work and the need for data about communities that really belongs to communities, being in the hands of community to use it in their own way, to address the issues and the questions that have meaning at the community level, not the questions that the government thinks are important.
And just to follow up on Beck's really good point, it's been noted in the chat, and I agree that Priority Reform 4 can't be dealt with in isolation from the other reform areas, and that in some ways, the sequencing of the reforms really matters, that you have to be working with Aboriginal community-controlled organisations and communities holistically in all of those areas, because there's a lot that government can learn from actually working in partnership. You can't get government data unless all of the practices, behaviors, mindsets, ways of working are actually implemented through the work that government has to do in partnership with community controlled organizations. So I think that's something to also consider when thinking about what it takes to actually genuinely get the results we want.
Spot on. Pete, I had this other question that came through. Can I also throw this to you first? Governments across Australia are grappling with how to reduce the contact of Aboriginal young people with the criminal justice system. Northern Territory, Queensland, I guess this is it's a pretty live issue. What could governments presumably, learn from this approach to evaluating around what works in this area?
Oh, so much. I would love for every bureaucrat in the country to read our evaluation report. Maybe I don't. Well, that's a lot of people. I think it's about recognizing that community solutions and pathways and environments and relationships and supports are found in the community, and they need to be led by community, and that what we understand to have value and to have impact and to kind of get outcomes are not concentrated in kind of government solutions or institutions or agencies. In fact, they can only come from working differently and that this work can show government how that can be done, and to see that it is robust and well organized and planned, and that community have capacity to do this. That would be the first thing, but I could also call on my other colleagues to have a go at answering that one.
Yeah, I think it's just, as you said, it demonstrates that when you relinquish power to communities to lead the solutions to community issues, the results are self-evident, and that should be encouraging to all governments across Australia that this is the appropriate way to work. To relinquish control to the community and collaborate properly on solutions. Yeah.
Thanks, Beck. Thanks, Pete. May, can I go to you now with a question around place-based initiatives, because you obviously work across a number of initiatives and partners and organisations working on place-based work. And I guess that question, that appetite for place-based work, and then that kind of grappling with, well, how does that fit with systems work, and how do you do, as Pete and Beck and others have described, meaningful community-led work, but keep your eye on the systems. I'm just interested if you've got reflections based on this work with Yuwaya Ngarra-li, but other work you're involved with about how to do that work meaningfully, particularly around this question about measuring outcomes and reflecting on evaluation.
Yeah, and I think that often we've had this discourse that place-based work and systems change work are different, whereas actually they're, the same kind of good. I guess systemic work is grounded in community, and kind of, effective place-based work is also thinking about and conscious of what needs to change more broadly and how that place can contribute to shifting some of those things more broadly. So, but I think in terms of how you kind of do that, what I've been really inspired by from the Elders group and the Yuwaya Ngarra-li initiative in general is having that really clear, quite bold long-term vision, so that ability to kind of think intergenerationally long-term, and also to have the confidence also based on their history, it being such a critical place historically for the freedom rides and for the development of a lot of Aboriginal community controlled organisations, Walgett, to think about, as the elders have put it, kind of their place in the nation. So, being willing to stand up and engage from their experience on national water policy, on, fines across the state, and to feel really strong and valid in doing that. And I think that has shown, the outcomes kind of show that has been influential, because it is powerful, it is credible, and both from the experience of the community, but also through the initiative, backed up by a lot of really rigorous research and data. So I just think it's a great encouragement for any place-based initiatives to be also kind of taking up their power and authority in other spaces. And I know that that's a challenge, because it can take you, you're then in a bit of a jostle between your working community and your work in other spaces. So that's a tension to be managed. But I think it's a great example of that influence.
Thank you, May. I think that's a beautiful place to wrap up. Thank you all for joining us and your interest as ever in our work. And please feel free at any time to get in contact if you've got questions or you'd like to catch up and talk about any aspect of our work. But thank you, Peta, Beck and May. Thank you, Izzy Burton-Clark, as ever, for wrangling the tech aspect of stuff and keeping us to time. And we look forward to seeing you at future webinars. Thank you.